I'm Raj. I'm a principal advisor at the Behavioural Insights team. Been working on the education team here a long time. And last year, I went to become a maths teacher as well. So I'm now in my second year of teaching at a school in East London. And there's two big takeaways I have from teaching so far. First one is, it's hard, isn't it? It's surprising. You never hear teachers mention it, but actually it's quite difficult. The second thing I realised was, in several years of education research, I was clearly in something of a bubble about the way evidence is perceived and the way it's used. And I heard this expression, which we've called the session here, teaching is an art, not a science, many times. And so I'm hoping we can unpack that a little bit today and work out how can we make the evidence that many of the people in this room produce more accessible, more usable to practitioners so we can come closer to being an evidence-based profession. I'm just going to briefly introduce my excellent panellists before we get into it. Professor Becky Francis is Director of the Institute of Education at UCL and has a formidable reputation education research and in policy. Ben Goldacre is a Senior Research Fellow at University of Oxford, also a doctor and writer, and I think has really helped shape the debate on how we can make robust evidence more accessible to practitioners, not just in health, but also some work in education too. And also delighted to welcome Harry Fletcher-Wood, who is Associate Dean at Ambition Institute. Harry is a former history teacher in India, Japan, and exotic London, and he now leads programs developing teachers and school leaders. Let's give them all a round of applause, please. So I'm going to guide the discussion here with a few broad themes. I'm going to try and find out those precise areas where maybe we don't quite agree and really unpack those, because I think that's where the juice is. And of course, welcoming input from all of yourselves over the course of the session. So let's start off here. Evidence-based practice is something we hear a lot as an expression. I want to hear from each of the panellists. I mean, what do we think evidence-based practice even looks like? And why is it a good idea? Becky, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I guess that we know a lot about what can help in the classroom, what benefits learning, and indeed what benefits teaching. And it's absolutely fundamental that to maintain excellence in our state education, that we really capitalise on that. So there's something about just basic value for money, as well as, of course, the really important job of supporting learning. And my area of research has been in educational inequality. And clearly we know that this, excellent practice in teaching makes the biggest impact on disadvantaged kids. So that's doubly important. So it is really important that we use the evidence we've got. Nevertheless, there is a range of complexity as to why that doesn't always land in the way that we anticipate, and I guess that that's precisely what we'll be discussing in the panel.
I know you're after conflict, so I'm going to dive in. Do we want evidence-based practice? I'm not sure we do. This is one of these debates that is either really productive or really tedious. Should it be evidence-based, evidence-led, evidence-informed? And I think I'm taken by the idea we want evidence-informed practice. We want teachers to be aware of the research, the things that maybe some of them are doing that they shouldn't be doing, like using learning styles. There are things that they should be doing, they may not be doing, like retrieval practice, but only the teacher can then make that fly at 4 p.m. with a bunch of Year 9s on a rainy Thursday. But I think if they are using that evidence, we know that students can do better as a result. So I echo Becky, it's crucial.
Ben, any thoughts?
Well, look, there are outcomes where it's easy and legitimate to collect data, and there are outcomes where it's hard to collect data. If people say the objective of education is to create well-rounded citizens at the age of 45 who are satisfied in their lives, then that's a long follow-up time. We'll probably all be dead by the time that trial reports its main outcome. But there often are short-term outcomes that are relevant to patients, to participants, and in this case, to pupils. And I think it's worth thinking, if there is an outcome that we can legitimately measure in data, if there is an intervention that is sufficiently specific and well stylised that we can standardise it and then we can do a randomised trial on it, then I think it's worth doing that. And it goes without saying, you can't do that for all aspects of what you do in a room with students as a teacher. But exactly the same is true of every other thing that we do trials on. It's exactly the same with medicine. I'm a doctor. Some things you can do randomised trials on, some things you can't. The one thing that I was struck by in the field of education when I first started becoming interested in the use of randomised trials outside of medicine about 8 years ago is that the conversations I saw happening in education reminded me a lot of the conversations that you saw in medicine in the 50s and 60s, where there was a lot of eminence-based practice rather than evidence-based practice, and the notion of creating evidence was regarded as something of a challenge to authority. And I think that's something that we saw in medicine maybe 50 or 60 years ago, but it's a corridor that we've walked through. And it seemed to me that education was in a similar place. But I have to say, with the fantastic work from EEF in particular, a lot of which, of course, has been done outside of conventional academia, I think there have been enormous leaps and bounds in renormalising the notion of doing randomised trials and also looking at other kinds of evidence.
Thanks. I think we've already touched upon a theme which I think is we're going to end up coming back to, and we will talk more about barriers and how we overcome them later. But Ben, you mentioned the word standardization, and Harry, you were talking more about evidence-informed. And I think this is where the biting point is going to be. Teachers often are averse to the idea of a one-size-fits-all policy. Becky, I know you've been talking about, fidelity really matters a lot in interventions. But I'm often looking at, for example, resources which are provided to teachers and think there's an opportunity to embed some kind of standardised practice there. Becky, it'd be great if you could tell us more. You've talked before about how education and health are different in the sense that you can't just give teachers pills. Sometimes the context of that might be complicated, but you can give them lesson plans. You can give them PowerPoints which embed retrieval practice. And you can give PowerPoints which don't mention learning styles explicitly. And I feel sometimes we're not doing enough there because we're worried about propagating this standardised approach. Do you have any early thoughts about if we're at the right level of standardisation?
So I think in a way a kind of minimum common standard is a sort of helpful way of thinking about starting points here. There is so much, as I've said, that evidence can support with. And actually one of the things that the Education Endowment Foundation work has been fantastic at is showing what doesn't work and myth-busting. And that's absolutely crucial. It's often overlooked or seen as sort of irrelevant, but it's absolutely crucial in minimising the snake oil, which is really prevalent in the system. Nevertheless, I was struck by a conversation recently about Microsoft and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and their caution, actually, from their early learning. They'd thought that, I quote, education would be easier than health, but they found exactly the opposite and are, I think, practicing admirable humility in taking a very slow and steady approach, actually, to their expansion in education because of these issues about the complexity of the classroom environment. Now, we've already had a really interesting conversation about this from the teacher perspective, and the difficulty in these messages around complexity, because what we don't want is to fall into a sort of excuses culture where, well, I don't use the evidence because all classrooms are different. But from my position as a researcher, my acknowledgement that fidelity is really difficult to achieve in the classroom because of the incredible diverse environments in which teachers are practicing, and somehow that really needs to be acknowledged, even if it's simply as a method to improve our research practice. So holding those things together is quite challenging.
Harry, can I bring you in as well, please, on that idea of whether at the optimal level of standardisation or whether that's maybe just not that possible in this field?
I don't think we're there yet, because I think there are lots of things that we could be doing every day that you don't see in most classrooms. I think what I'd be keen to do is standardise around principles rather than practices. I think what's very easy is I've got like an activity that works brilliantly and I tell everyone and then everyone copies my activity. And often we get then what we call lethal mutations, that people have missed the original purpose of the activity and then they're copying it elsewhere. So what I'd be really keen that we do is make sure that, okay, this is the underlying goal. Here's a thing that I think will help you to achieve it. So our underlying goal is retrieval practice. Here are 10 questions you could use. Now, you, Raj, might be really inventive and want to like tweak some of those questions because you think you can do them better. That's great. But my minimum is everyone doing a bit of retrieval every lesson to go back to things they've learned previously. And I guess the other thing is, I think, as you're alluding to with lesson plans, like, can we bake these things into our resources, for example? Because lots of teachers are incredibly busy. They're not all planning lessons from scratch. If on the PowerPoint or the scheme of work, there's like, actually, here's a really good point to go back to what they learned 3 months ago and draw that in and make sure they remember it and link it to what we're learning today. That is both making teachers' lives easier, but it's, you could say, standardising. And I think it's this kind of intelligent adaptation that we're trying to get to. Fidelity around the principles.
Ben, can you tell us a little bit about how this happened in health? So once there was this idea, there is such a thing as perhaps some level of objective evidence that we can use. I mean, who's responsible? Who takes leadership for spreading that within a system? I mean, because it would be useful to glean insights from that as to whether we should be targeting principals or individual teachers.
Well, so before we think about dissemination and critical review of research by practitioners, which I think is incredibly important, just on the standardization issue, I think it's really important not to mischaracterize research in medicine as being about pills. Randomized trials in medicine are done on comparing different surgical interventions, comparing whole systems of care, randomized trials looking at the impact of public health interventions, whether they're simple leaflets or more complex social interventions. Randomized trials are done on different ways of interacting with patients, different forms of talking treatments around preventing relapse or reducing symptoms in depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD. So I think it's really important to get away, first of all, from the pills analogy, which I think doesn't really stand. And also, it's really important to reflect that those arguments and discussions go back a really long way in medicine. So I think I've talked about it before in an education context, but Archie Cochrane, who is one of the great grandparents of evidence-based medicine, in his autobiography describes an enormous and very dramatic battle with some of the leaders in coronary care in the UK. So we just invented coronary care units, and coronary care units could do quite a lot for people with very specific cardiac problems, but for somebody who just had a heart attack, we actually didn't have anything to offer you. So the norm was go back to be treated by your GP. But because we'd set up coronary care units, everybody thought, oh, well, the experts should be looking after the patients who've had heart attacks in hospital. And Archie Cochrane said, well, I'm not sure if you're doing good or harm. We don't have any specific treatments. We should do a randomized trial comparing the very simple question, should you go home and be managed by your GP after your heart attack, or should you be admitted to a coronary care unit? Everybody was very resistant. It was impossible to get funding. The ethics committee said it was unethical. All of the cardiologists were very cross, and it got to the point where when he finally did the trial, he went to present the interim results, and he put up the interim results in front of a room full of cardiologists, and he said, well, I'm really sorry to have to tell you, it looks like you were right. We've looked, and the rate of death amongst people who've gone back to GP care instead of your coronary care units is higher. And the room erupted. People talked about referring him to the GMC, and then he went, only kidding. Pulled the front sheet off the whiteboard, and then he had the real results. And the real results were that the coronary care units were killing patients for a variety of reasons. Maybe it was over-treatment, over-investigation, poor mobilisation. So it's really important to recognise that randomised trials of complex interventions are bread and butter. They are completely the norm throughout medicine, and there's nothing that is endogenously different. There's nothing about the variation between pupils that is any materially different to the variation between patients and the difference between settings. However, every now and then, people will do randomised trials on stuff that you think are a bit silly in education. And I think that cuts to the core of something that Becky was saying, and also to the core of the importance of dissemination and creating a whole network of people who are engaged with evidence, the ecosystem impact of getting good evidence. Every now and then I look at some of the EEF trials which get a negative result. They find that some whiz-bang thing that people have been promoting didn't work. And I look at the trial and I think, of course that didn't work. It'll be, so I'm colliding examples, right? But it'll be something like somebody will have been marketing a some amazing one-week science program, and they say, oh, this amazing whiz-bang science program will increase the A-level performance of your pupils by 1 grade in exchange for this one-week program. And you think, well, why on earth did you do a trial of that? It was obvious that wasn't going to hit its primary endpoint. And then you take a step back and you think, well, the reason you did a trial of it is because there are people out there saying that. And actually, if you don't have a culture of doing randomized trials, if you don't have a culture of submitting people's whiz-bang claims to robust evaluation, then you create an ecosystem, you create a culture in which people can push all kinds of snake oil very freely. And so I think those trials, which at first glance appear to be absolutely ludicrous, are in fact playing a really valuable role in modifying the culture around education.
Thanks, Ben. We've got some great questions coming. I'm just going to bring some of those in. One at the top is going to segue neatly into the next topic, which is about, okay, we've discussed a little bit about what we think evidence-based practice looks like. We're just wondering, where are we then? Where are we now? The question at the top is, have we got examples where good ideas have got in front of teachers and spread? And I think really what I want to discuss is related to that, like how are we doing? Where are we on our journey of evidence-based practice? I think we've mentioned EF a couple of times. Lots of people in this room will know how much work they've done changing the culture, bringing schools into trials, but we're clearly not quite yet where we want to be. Harry, you're working a lot training with school leaders and the like. Where do you think we are on this journey?
We're a lot better than we were when Ben first got involved a few years ago, for which, partially, thanks, Ben. We're a long way from where we need to be. I was training a large number of middle leaders last week, and I was sort of saying, oh, who's heard of Daniel Willingham, who's one of the prominent cognitive scientists who we use quite a lot. And I was sort of getting no hands up in the room. And so I think there's a long way to go to get everyone where we want them to be. And that's not so, lots of people are doing good things, but they don't necessarily know why they're working or exactly where this is. Back to this thing, practices spread quite quickly, but principles and the underlying evidence spreads more slowly. I think you've got, so one of the things that I'm really interested in is learning styles, which I don't, kids learn in visual, auditory and kinesthetic ways, differentiate your lesson accordingly. So my final assessment after my initial training, there was a box in it, have you done that? That's no longer the case. And yet there are still some trainers that every now and then you hear, oh, guess what we got trained in recently? Someone turned up and told us about learning styles. Or you talk to a teacher and you're saying, oh, this, that, and the other. Oh, yeah, that's quite like a thing I do, which is using learning styles. So we're heading in the right direction, but it's really slow. And this idea of how long it takes ideas to diffuse, many, many years for them to become common.
Learning styles just will not die. It's amazing how often I hear about them. Becky, what's your experience working?
So, coming back to my former point, I think that we know more about what doesn't work than what does. Obviously, we do have increasing evidence on things that do help and that teachers do need to take seriously. But in terms of where we are, I think that we need to think much more about sort of communities of practice, reflecting on research evidence, what it means, and how this can work particularly well in school contexts. Likewise, we, the research community, need to think much more about what are the key gaps. One of the problems, I think, in the kind of early days of rush to RCT in the education context has been what interventions have we got? What can we put forward? And funding those trials, rather than thinking, what are the crucial questions in the classroom that we might be able to answer? Because often those interventions don't yet exist. And if I give an example of my own RCT work and my own areas of focus, attainment grouping, it's a perfect example in two ways. On the one hand, it showed the importance of fidelity, why we couldn't encourage many schools to take a more equitable approach to setting practice, attainment grouping, because of the different challenges teachers face on the ground. And if I can give an example that I call tail wagging dog, timetabling kept coming back again and again as an explanation and excuse for why we can't do better. And we can talk more about that if that's helpful, about the different things on the ground that prevent research-led practice. But also the point is about gaps. So on the one hand, while we're showing the lack of effect of attainment grouping, why that's detrimental, particularly to disadvantaged learners, we don't know enough about effective mixed attainment practice. So it would be very irresponsible for me as a researcher to tell all teachers, right, you've got to start doing mixed ability grouping, when we don't actually know very much about how that's done well. So there's a key set of challenges, both for practitioners and for researchers in this field. We're getting there, but we have a long way to go.
So, I mean, here's a troubling thought, right? In medicine, in everything, most of what you try doesn't work. And most of what does work has a teeny tiny impact. And that's true everywhere. So there was a review out recently, all of the newest, most recently approved oncology drugs. The odds of a new drug being better than the one we already have are just very slightly over 50-50. Similarly, your chances of dying as a middle-aged man have halved over the last 3 or 4 decades. That's not because of any single amazing epoch-making breakthrough. And that's actually the cause for optimism, I think. That improvement in mortality is from the aggregation of thousands and thousands of tiny modifications. Now, that's the reality of forward progress in medicine, in education, and in all fields. And it requires a degree of humility, but it also means something quite important for how you do research, because it means that you're going to need really big numbers of trials, because a lot of stuff you try won't work, and you're going to need really big numbers in your trials because the effects you're trying to detect are going to be absolutely teeny tiny. Now, from that follows all kinds of extra stuff, like, for example, you're going to have to make sure that you've got facilitative regulatory structures. You've got to make sure that you've got professions where people go, oh, God, yes, without even thinking about it, yes, of course, we'll participate in a trial. We're already participating in 15. Because you've got to get those big numbers through if you want to detect tiny effects that only come out positive very occasionally.
Okay, thanks. Just keep the questions coming in. I'll notice a lot of them are related to the barriers to adopting evidence, which I think we're going to move on to shortly, which I expect to take up the lion's share of the discussion, and then we'll come on to some of the solutions as well. So please do keep them coming in. Couple here about the barriers. Some seem to be, I think we were talking beforehand just about external validity. We've already talked about this a little bit. When EEF does a trial, even if there's a result, I've noticed many school leaders and teachers just sort of say, okay, that's interesting, wasn't my school, we didn't participate in that trial. Even when Behavioural Insights team and others have run trials with EEF, nearly every single school will ask us, can you give us the result for our school? And then we'll sort of have this long discussion and we'll sort of say, look, well, there's 20,000 kids here. We don't have statistical power to give you the result just for your school. And also we've randomised at the school level. I mean, everybody in your school did the intervention and they go, yep. Can you give us the results for our school? And I think this seems to me the major challenge. And sometimes we try to address it conceptually. I certainly realise statistical power is not the best way to do it. It just seems many teachers or principals don't have that emotional connection to the results of some kids elsewhere. They don't think, okay, this means us. I mean, what do we do about that? How do we help them think, this research means you, this is who we're talking about? In fact, Becky, you'd like to go first on this one?
Well, partly it's about research literacy, I think, and this is a real challenge. And, you know, as my organisation, obviously, we're the largest single deliverer of initial teacher education. So we're training sort of 1,600 new teachers a year. That supply into the profession and encouraging research literacy among those incipient teachers is fundamental, I think, and something that in the past hasn't had that much attention. You know, if you're, I don't know, you have a history degree or a French degree, a brilliant student coming into initial teacher training, but you won't have any idea about empirical research necessarily, or social scientific research. So actually embedding that research literacy, and I think that initial teacher training is the kind of would be the bedrock of where you would try to do that, is I think absolutely fundamental to nurturing this new collaborative environment between research and practice, and fundamental to teachers being able to engage research, because otherwise they won't be able to make meaning from whatever publications they can access. And I think the other responsibility is for bridging organisations, whether it's the Chartered College of Teaching or indeed the Education Endowment Foundation Toolkit, or the many other exemplars that we can think of that are doing that brokering work, if you like, in distilling research practice. That's important too.
I think that's incredibly important, because most teachers have never been through initial teacher training that teaches them the basics on the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research, where it is and is not informative, strengths and weaknesses of observational quantitative research, strengths and weaknesses of randomised trials, what a systematic review and meta-analysis are, and why they're useful, and why they can sometimes have shortcomings. And if you've not been taught that, then of course there will be challenges. I think it is important to reflect that traditionally there has been something of an active barrier to that. So it's not true to say in England that kind of passively didn't happen. I think in the past, and this, there will be people in this room perhaps who have very strongly held views on this, but in the past it wasn't just an absence of randomised trials and quantitative research in the British educational research establishment in particular. I think there was a lot of very active, energetic and quite well-resourced antipathy towards quantitative research. And so people who were advocating for approaches like randomised trials, observational quantitative research, and so on, weren't just coming into a vacuum, they were being actively pushed back. So there is an important history to why we don't do it. And there's also an ongoing issue, I think, which is in the same way that everybody's got a bee in their bonnet and one thing that they want on the curriculum for students, in the same way, everyone's got a bee in their bonnet about something that they want on the initial teacher training standard courses. And for good or for ill, in general, conservative ideology is do not dictate what is on those kinds of curricula. So there are now some places that are putting research methods on initial teacher training. There are plenty of places that aren't. And of course, crucially, people in senior decision-making roles are more likely to have been trained a long time ago and not had access to that kind of education. And the one thing that I don't know, and you may know better than I, is if I was a deputy head or a head and I wanted to learn about this stuff and I've got one inset day to give you, where do I go? Who do I pay?
This is an excellent question. In fact, you may have read it off my sheet that we're going to be asking later. Harry, you train teachers. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what we've been talking about here, but also just briefly like to reflect on the fact I did teacher training last year, and even having run randomised control trials and so on, by the time I was in my first week of lessons, my head is full with stuff like, how does the printing work? I've got 4 minutes to find room M212. I don't know what any part of that means. I don't know how to pronounce 7 of these kids' names. Hang on a minute, was it year 9 or year 11? Apparently I'm teaching trigonometry. I haven't done that myself since 1996. Teachers are absolutely stressed out to anything. You've already alluded to this, Ben. So we're bringing them something new for them to engage with. It tends not to spiritually align with what they thought they were going into profession for, which is to make a personal connection with these students. Do they have the capacity for this?
So you've given me the courage to disagree with our august panellists. I don't know if teachers should be the ones who are pushing to be evidence literate. I say that as a history graduate who loved history and wanted to teach history and had never met a p-value until I stopped being a history teacher and did whatever I do now, like training, design and research stuff. And I think we need to take account of the fact that actually, if you look at the reasons why most teachers become teachers, they like the subject, they like kids, they want to make a difference to society, and use it. Yeah, sure, they want to do it in the best possible way, but becoming an evidence literate practitioner is maybe a number 5, 6, 7 on their list. I would say. So I have trained teachers for many years in Sweden as well as in England, and I take them some videos of English schools and American schools, and they're always like, it's not a Swedish school, so I just can't learn anything from it. And I raised this in a teacher training session in America with one of the organisations that makes most of these videos, and someone said, oh, look, I'm working in one of these schools where they film a lot of these videos, and I'm a 6th grader, and they'll say the same thing. If it was the 5th grade class, and they're like, it's not the same. So you've got to accept that teachers are always going to be a little bit sceptical about anyone telling them what to do. So to your point, Raj, I think we need to start by worrying about what teachers worry about. And so when I'm designing a session now, I spend the first 15 minutes trying to make everyone miserable and focusing on the problem. And so whatever, like if I'm going to teach them what does the evidence say on memory, just start with like, what's really annoying? What's really annoying how you teach kids stuff and then they forget it all. Tell me a time that happened recently. And, oh yeah, this was annoying. I taught the kid, I know I'd done it perfectly, didn't work. Okay, let's dig into that. Why does that happen? And then I'll present them the evidence, but also then credible role models. And so I might present the evidence, but actually then I need to move away and say, okay, this is what the evidence says. Here's Fred, he teaches down the way. This is what he's done, and he's done it in maths, and so-and-so's done it in English, and so on. And I think the role of, as Ben says, it's about the decision makers, it's about the intermediaries, it's about the research lead, the deputy head, knowing what's going on, and then being able to design the training. And I'm sceptical that that's the role of the teacher, given that they're also trying to make the photocopy at work at 8:55.
Ben and Becky, which of you wants to respond first? Ben, you look.
Well, I feel ambivalent. It's clearly a genuine challenge. I think the what would you do in one-day training on this is a really good challenge. Clearly, you're not.
What would you do, but where would you go?
Where would you go?
Who can they give 500 quid to?
But
or
I mean,
2,000
how
quid
meaningful would it also be? I mean, I'm thinking
it
it's a real challenge to go to any depth. And level of conceptual understanding in the way that Harry's suggesting is very challenging, especially to people with no sort of prior knowledge of that discipline at all. So again, I would come back to my point about the sort of the responsibility of brokers. But nevertheless, I do think that as professionals, if we're going to engage with research effectively, we do need better research literacy than we have at the moment. As I've been listening and thinking through, and I'm on various working groups at the DFE in relation both to the early careers teachers framework, but also at the moment on ITT policy and content there. We need to find space for this. Ben's absolutely right. The initial teacher training programs are incredibly squeezed already with necessary content. Are they too short? This is something that we as a profession wrestle with all the time. They probably need to be longer, and we probably need to think about that particularly seriously if we are going to ensure a research literate profession. But as Ben's already indicating, of course, that doesn't come for free.
A friend of mine's just qualified as an accountant, and the exams she had to pass had a pass mark of 61%. Now, I tell you that, firstly, because it alarmed me. But secondly, nobody expects every practitioner to be perfect at every part of the field that they work in. I don't think anybody should feel persecuted that they're not fully evidence literate. I think what we do need to do is to make it possible for those who have some interest to develop that interest. If I think about how it works in medicine, in any given general practice or any given outpatient clinical team of consultants, you will have variegation amongst the practitioners in what they specialise in. There'll be one person who's really good at talking to people with emotional and behavioural problems, one person who's really good at seeing young, one who's really good with kids, one person who's a massive nerd and reads the journals and looks at the stuff. And I guess that's what you mean by brokers, and it happens both formally and informally. But it does require that there is somewhere that you could go if you were interested. And I keep coming back to this. If you were a teacher who wanted to know about this stuff, where's your CPD budget and who do you give the check to if you want to start from naught, if you want to start from wherever you are? Because you've got to have structures to support the people who have some interest, and it's unrealistic to expect that everybody will. I think also those structures have to go beyond just a dollop of knowledge that gets given to you. You also need to work with it. So if I think again about medicine, there is a whole ecosystem of structures around evidence-based practice where research is done. Those findings are then transmitted, passed on to practitioners, not just through fiddly, obscure journal articles, but also easy-to-read précis and précis of systematic reviews. They're then discussed in something called Journal Club, where you come together with other practitioners and you go, what do we think of this study? Is it any good? Has it got any flaws? Will I change my practice on the basis of it? If not, why not? Is it because I think there's an irredeemable flaw with the research? In which case, how would I do that better to answer the questions that matter to me? Then those questions that come directly from practitioners, perfectly or imperfectly, are beamed and transmitted back up. So NIHR, for example, run really an open suggestions box, right? If you think there's a question that's unresolved in medicine, you can fill out a one-page form and go, I think you need to, we don't know which of these 2 multiple sclerosis treatments is best. We don't know if this CBT method is better than that CBT method for PTSD. And it goes into prioritization groups where people go through, and then that's used to inform the choices. And then there are research networks where schools who are interested in participating in research can put their hand up, or rather GP practices can put their hands up and say, yeah, I'm interested. And if you're not, then fine. But if you are, then good. We'll take you and we'll work with you. And you've got to have all of those structures in place. You can't just go, here's a leaflet, here's a book, here's a bit of ITT. And I know that we're not disagreeing on that. But, I think it comes down to those structures. And the most basic thing of all is, where's the company that will take what does an inset day, what do you get for going into a school to do a day of teaching? $2,000? 3? Don't know. Where's the company that will take that check and send the invoice and deliver the intervention?
So I want to take another question here. There's one up here at the top. The biggest barrier to teachers' engagement with research is their workload. And can you discuss? And this is what I was alluding to at the beginning. We're talking a lot here about structures that need to be built around in a slow and steady building of capacity. And I'm a little bit sceptical of it. Again, resorting to personal anecdote here, I apologise for that. But in 2 different schools I worked in last year, in one I was told, engage with research, find the one that works best for you, use your professional judgment, which I found laughable. I'd been doing the job for about 2 months and didn't really know what I was doing. And the second school, the SLT, the senior leadership team, they clearly engaged with a lot of the research that Harry was talking about earlier from cognitive psychology. And I went into the maths department and they said, these are our lessons. Okay? Now, I could edit them. I could, put in more analogies related to football, as I want to do in nearly every talk I ever give. But they said, these are our lessons, this is how it's done. Now, you could walk out of one of my classrooms, walk down the corridor, walk into the next one, and you'll see pretty much the same lesson being delivered. The same style. They've researched nearly every critical aspect of it. A lot of it was taken from Craig Barton's How I Wish I Taught Maths, which is an absolutely excellent book, giving you really careful prescriptive advice on how to do it. And I thought, this is amazing. I'm like getting to 3:30. I don't really have that much to do. Like, the lessons are planned. I've marked them according to a pre-made work scheme. And, okay, so I understood a little bit of the background research, but I don't think I needed to. And I think just appealing to the fact on the workload argument, if you're so busy, just do this first. This is our best bet. And then let us know if you don't think it works. And I've become increasingly sceptical that teachers need to be given more training or need to be brought along with everybody on the research journey. Whether they've developed after 5 or 6 years, sure. But at the moment, I'm not so sure. What do you guys think of that challenge? Becky, I might come back to you first.
I'm ambivalent. There's been lots of debate about this, and in a way, I think I'm probably, this is a question for Harry, probably more than me, because I feel this is a question for practitioners. I'm not at the chalk face. I'm certainly not somebody that thinks that this is anathema and that teachers should be starting every lesson fresh and that without that you're not a proper professional or you're not delivering your own creativity. I think that having high quality materials is going to be really useful as a baseline and potentially in the way that you say is going to secure high quality teaching and save workload and so forth. Nevertheless, I think that necessarily, of course, the teacher brings something of themselves to the classroom. And my worry is about deprofessionalisation, which we saw a little bit with the New Labour learning strategies and so forth. Whenever we roll out curriculum and curriculum materials to such a fulsome extent that teachers stop thinking carefully about what it is they're doing or lose the skills to create, then we run a risk. So I think it's about that balance. I don't think this is just for teaching, by the way. I've had experiences where, with my own GP, where it really seems as though what they're doing is clicking on a website and getting instructions, which I sort of think, well, I could have done that at home. So that, I guess at the heart of a profession, and as we've discussed, a research literate profession, needs to be that constant thinking and reflection about what it is we're doing. But that does not mean in any way that I'm actually sort of pressing back and, as I say, saying that every teacher needs to design from scratch.
Thank you. Harry?
So I think this is where the analogy of doctors is interesting, right? So the point that doctors are doing the great things Ben's describing with Journal Club is the point of doing it autonomously is some are post their 7 years of training, whereas as Becky says, with 5, apologies, F1, anyway. So you get 1 year of training, and I don't know if all teachers are ready to do that kind of thinking until, as Raj says, you need to know the basics before you can start playing more interesting melodies. And we know that if we want teachers to be able to do the basics, make it easy for them, make it attractive, blah, 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 blah. So give them the lessons to start with and then help them to find ways to adapt. This argument of de-skilling is really interesting because I think there's a really good case, you shouldn't be planning from scratch every day because the stuff that you're teaching, if you're a maths teacher and you're teaching trigonometry, so are 30, 40,000 other maths teachers this week. The places where kids struggle are not wildly different, whether you're in Oldham or Hackney or anywhere else. So actually, you shouldn't be having to work out as a new teacher, what analogy would be good? You might then want to personalise it with a football one to evoke your personality. But if there's a route one because I'm not very thoughtful to come up with my own analogy, that's going to make my life a lot simpler. So to this deprofessionalisation argument, I've always thought we should be giving teachers more, and I've never had a really good answer to this until I read Richard and Daniel Susskind's book about the future of the professions, which I strongly recommend. And they say, if we want teachers, they say in general, if we want a professional to be good at adapting things, it's not necessarily years of grunt work through trial and error that's the best way. Maybe we need to give teachers a month shadowing a really effective teacher, just looking at the way they adapt their lesson planning, which is something we don't do, and then they'll know how to adapt rather than 5 years of messing up their adaptations to eventually work out what does and doesn't work.
I'm really sorry for busting in, by the way. The nature of a professional is to be the human interface between the real person in front of you and the standard tools and the standard evidence that you have. And I think that, once again, generalises between medicine, education, and I think also things like law and maybe even accountancy. I think if you want people to be able to spend more time thinking about these things, you need to facilitate that, and it's all about trade-offs in a fixed resource setting. The only place that I'm aware of that routinely does, for example, journal clubs is Shanghai and Singapore. Now, the crucial difference there is they have much larger class sizes. So the trade-off there was fewer hours per week in actually directly in the classroom teaching students, and more hours looking at research, thinking about it, planning lessons, and so on. Now, as I understand it, the last time I looked was about 5 or 6 years ago. The evidence on class size having much material impact on outcomes was pretty thin, but at the same time, class size is one of those things that politicians, newspaper columnists, and parents feel like it's a concrete metric that they can hold on to. So bigger classes would be an unpopular trade-off, but those are the kinds of trade-offs that you have to make. And I think, it's really telling that the only place that has really invested a lot of teacher time in engaging with research have got bigger class sizes, and that's how they've managed the resource limitations.
Not always, I think, though. I completely take the point, and the evidence on class size is a sort of a really intriguing issue in its own right. But we are one of the worst countries in the world for teacher time and CPD. There are very diverse countries and arrangements that have more lesson plan time and more reflection time than the UK. And I guess, to be fair on the present government, that's something that they've tried to address through the Early Careers Framework, and which is intended to give a bit more support for the first 2 years of teaching after initial teacher training. But of course, again, still it's fractional. And I absolutely agree that, if we want teachers to engage, they have to have time to do that.
Well, and also I think they have to have career pathways that could potentially lead them into that. I mean, I'm sure many of you have heard of BERA, the British Education and Research Association. So when I was looking at this a few years ago, I pulled all of their conference programs, and there are a few things that were striking. Firstly, there was very little on quantitative research. A lot of the presentations were quite similar year on year, but most strikingly to me, it was a 4-day-long conference that took place on weekdays in school term time. Now, the Royal College of GPs conference is a bit annoying because it's over weekend days and then maybe 1 or 2 work days. They've got childcare there so that you can front up with your kids and leave them with a stranger in a slightly alarming way. I don't feel like I see in the education research community the kind of free movement between practitioner and research that I see not just in medicine but in other fields. I don't see a kind of standard career trajectory. I don't see open competitive fellowships. And most importantly, I don't see career pathways where, as I've done over the course of 20 years, you can be sometimes working clinically and sometimes working in research. And I think if you don't have that kind of social glue, then you're really going to be hindered in getting better connections between the more abstract research and the practical coalface.
Thanks, Ben. There's a fun question up here, which has been up there for a while. I want to bring it in so it can start pivoting us towards solutions. If we had a school where it was almost 100% scripted, I'm going to take 100% as a figure of speech there, almost 100% scripted based on current evidence and best practice, how do we think that would perform compared to the typical school?
Sorry, can I just stop? What is this scripted? Is this a kind of straw man about how to standardise teaching? Is that what you mean?
It does. So yeah, we get the lesson like now say this, now do that. There are definitely American school districts where it's literally like, hey Ben, do this, and if you go faster or slower, you're in trouble, even if you can see your kid's not doing very well. I apologise that I've never heard of that, but it sounds absurd to me. And if that's what anybody in this room thinks you'd have to do a randomised trial, then I think it's worth saying. I don't recognise that. That seems odd to me. So it's interesting to see that, like, for example, Bridge in Liberia are doing a thing where they're giving teachers iPads, and it is scripted. It's now say this, now do that. And I think that's probably an appropriate approach if you're in a country where many of the teachers have not themselves got the educational qualifications that they're trying to teach to. In that case, scripting is probably quite helpful. I think it's helpful to provide scripts for some bits that people can adapt, like, hey Raj, here's a really good way to introduce trigonometry. Play around with it if you want, but this is a thing that we as a department have refined. I think even if it were brilliantly scripted, there's the psychological thing of reactance. People don't like being told what to do. So I think even if you had the best script in the world, the mechanism by which you then get people to do it would annoy people so much that it wouldn't be worth the bother, quite apart from whether or not it's a good idea.
Sounds like an absolutely surreal straw man to me, I would say. I mean, TES is the website, the forum is full of really great lesson plans, which are really interesting to browse and mooch around, even if you're not a teacher. But I've never heard of things being 100% scripted. Nuts.
And I mean, I think that in addition to what's being said, I mean, I've raised the issue about professionalisation and deprofessionalisation. I mean, we really need to nurture the profession. I think this is very different in different nations. The point that you've made, Harry, some people are, if you're working in incredibly disadvantaged, maybe, rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa, we can make the same point about learning via technology only, which, as you know, some ed tech firms are very keen that you can do. Actually, if that's the alternative to no education at all, then yes, that may be better. But we know that in national societies like this one, that actually that's going to be incredibly detrimental rather than beneficial. The other point that I think is really important to make, and I think that this is, relates even to the prior points about sort of fixed curricula, we don't have enough evidence yet and the evidence is quickly changing. So, whether it is the developing work around memory or all sorts of other areas where we have a bit of a feel for what's going on. We were talking about mindset earlier. That would be another good example. But actually, it still comes down to, there are lots of crucial questions still outstanding. We know that this is a work in progress. So by tying things down too precisely, we'll just be in a situation where you have to rewrite all this stuff in a year's time, or it will be very problematic if we don't. So I think that those are key risks with that kind of approach.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here about the way that we're conducting research, and I think I'm going to sort of unify them. And is it just that RCTs and the output of them can fit? This is back to the external validity issue here, really. We say that something works or it doesn't work, and then I think it was, is it Rob Coe or Steve Higgins? I'm sure you'll know Harry, who says, everything wworks somewhere, nothing works everywhere. Who was it?
Steve Higgins.
Dylan Williams. Dylan Williams, there you go.
Everyone said it at some point.
Exactly, yeah. Now everyone said it because Dylan Williams said it, and now I've forgotten. And is it that the way we're producing research isn't really speaking to practitioners? So should there be more accompanying qualitative work? Do we need to find out more about the mediating mechanisms for people to really buy into it? I'm going to propose a counter-hypothesis to that in a moment, which is just that we don't appeal to emotional narratives quite as much as we should do, and show you a video that we've made attempting to do that. But what do you think of that initial proposition that, for us, looking for statistically significant effect seems to be exciting enough, and that we don't look enough at the accompanying qualitative opinion and what the mediating effects might be? What do you think of that, Becky?
Well, Dylan William is a dear colleague and still an associate member of the IOE, so I need to tread carefully. But of course, on one level, his statement, which, as you say, is frequently replicated, it is very well, it's right, of course. However, I'm not sure how helpful it is, and whenever I hear it, I wonder, is this actually helpful? Because it does give everybody a massive get-out clause, doesn't it? Oh, well, in that case, why would we bother? And actually, I'm not sure either, if I think hard about it, that it's even true that everything works, somewhere. It may be that if you're a fantastic teacher and you use an approach that actually has been evidenced to be less effective than another, because you're an amazing, charismatic, brilliant at interaction and inspiring people, you actually make it work. But nevertheless, that doesn't detract from the fact that you might have done it better if you were using the evidence method. And there are some things that we know are detrimental across the board, and there are some things we know are beneficial across the board. So, I think that it's really important that we bear in mind some of the points that we've already discussed about the importance of environment and context, the importance of fidelity and so forth. But nevertheless, I think that we can make helpful generalisations.
Harry, what do you think?
Sometimes.
Thanks, Becky. Harry, what do you think? Do you think the way research is being produced is a bit simplified and we need more discussion of mediating effects and these permutations that Becky was discussing?
I think we want to get at the underlying principles. I think the people... stick your hand up if you're familiar with the work of Deans for Impact. If you're interested in this stuff, you might want to have a look. So they've come up with things like a super clear guide to teaching. It's like 8 pages, bullet points. Here's a thing you might want to do. Kids need to use to link new learning to prior knowledge. The end. I think and what I notice when I read medical articles is they're often shorter and they have clearer summary boxes than educational articles, which are often like 25 pages, and you get to like, I'm not quite sure what should I do as a result. That's probably an unfair generalisation. But yeah, I think we need to... If you look at what the EF did, they started off with, every teacher, we want them to be running their own trials and being research literate, and they've moved more to here are guidance reports. Here's a poster which has the key points from the guidance report on it. Here's guidance on how to implement this in your school, because they've recognised that actually just producing the research isn't enough, going back to where teachers' priorities lie. So yeah, we need to make it as easy and as clear as possible, because the misinformation is out there. We've had loads of sessions about that. There's loads of people who are like, hey, pick your favourite learning style, here's a quiz. we need to make sure that our evidence, that the things that are actually true, are as nimble as that, if not nimbler.
I'm going to come back to that point in one moment. Ben, do you have anything to add in this discussion?
Look, I'm really sorry to keep coming back to the parallels in medicine, but we have a spectacular and terrifying implementation gap in medicine between best evidence informed guidelines and then clinical practice. And if you're interested, just look on PubMed for Goldacre-B, and you'll find maybe 10 or 15 papers we've published in the last 2 years on how doctors are routinely breaching the guidance on which statin to give. So this isn't just, do you want a statin? This is, you've decided to take a statin, but doctors are routinely still prescribing low-intensity statins that don't give the same benefits. You'll find enormous variation in how quickly people respond to changes in guidance on which antibiotic to use for a urinary tract infection, how quickly or slowly people respond to safety alerts on how to prescribe methotrexate. And these are all crucially easy things to change. They're not hard things like prescribe fewer Valium pills. These are easy, like for like switch. It's simple knowledge dissemination. For the simplest, it's your favourite caricature of medicine, right? Swapping one pill for another. And we still can't get that right. So dissemination is incredibly hard. The difference is, in education, I honestly don't see what is being done right now to even try and do it, really. I see the EEF website, which is good, but only for EEF stuff. You can buy a book from Dylan Williams. They're all really expensive because they're academic publishers, but also he has sort of become this charismatic leader figure whose name itself is used as a kind of talisman, and his books sit in this, I think, slightly uneasy halfway house between evidence and eminence now, and that's not necessarily his fault. I think that's a systems process that has squirted him into that peculiar role. And I don't see just a simple clearinghouse on what works. I don't see bite-sized summaries of. You probably don't want the latest trials. You want bite-sized summaries of updated systematic reviews of all the trials on a given topic. I don't see that. So, although I appreciate that you might have concerns about whether you're tugging on people's heartstrings enough when you're trying to change their behaviour, it does seem to me from the outside like I don't see the basics getting done well.
Two things, if I may. One, so I know the colleagues from EEF probably in here. They have been producing these really helpful bite-sized reports on how you can improve evidence-based maths teaching. So I think I've really been encouraged. They've been moving in that direction. And also, speaking to your point earlier, Harry, they've been looking a lot more about what teachers are worrying about. So I think talking to Robbie Coleman there, they said, everybody knows about the randomised controlled trial of chess, but 99% of your teaching day is not about are the kids going to play chess or not. It's what am I going to start this lesson with. So they're certainly moving in that direction.
And to add, I mean, it's not that I'm pushing back on the point, because I think there's much more that we as the IOE can do, but the whole sector can do as well on this. What I would mention is both the epicentre at the IOE that really started the movement in systematic reviewing as applied to education, and also the research schools movement. I mean, the Education Endowment Foundation have got their research schools. We also have a research schools network, and I know that there are, I think there was one connected to Cambridge and so forth. So, and I guess the Chartered College of Teaching is another. It's not necessarily systematic, but their journal is, again, a sort of distillation of research findings and so forth for the sort of average classroom practitioner.
Sorry,
so
what's
think
it called?
Chartered College of Teaching. I can't remember
what's their
what is it,
publication?
research?
Impact.
Impact.
Yes,
That's it.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think that absolutely there is much more that we can and should do, perhaps that we must do, but I think that the work is beginning, for sure.
So just one quick point. Go on, Ben, go on.
Well, so you're a prof. You're on lots of review groups in DFE. What do you need to fix this? How much do you need? What for? And where? And, have you asked?
Yeah, so will be good takeaways for me. I think the point about resource is a good one. I think some of the earlier discussion that we had about incentives and attention is a good one. I think that as I've said already, I think that the movement has started, and I think that actually the research excellence framework, where we're talking about nudge practice and incentives, the research excellence frameworks, much greater focus now on impact and metrics around impact and so on, have definitely driven academics across the board in all disciplines far more to thinking about how their research lands and doing the work to engage practitioners with that, and policymakers too, of course. So I think that is having genuinely a strong effect. But nevertheless, it's a sort of work in progress, and people are having to upskill themselves as they go. So I think there is more that can be done, and sure enough, there is more that will be done.
Can I just come back on one thing, Ben?
I'd love to read
again.
impact, but I can't, because I have to pay.
You're not a member.
I have to pay to be a member. I can't even buy
so
an
if
issue.
you
I
are
have to
a
pay
new
to be a
teacher,
member.
you do get it for free.
And it won't be indexed. It won't be on Google. It won't be findable on a whim. You know, you've got to meet people where they are and disseminate proactively.
If you are a new teacher, you will be given your free membership for the first year, and I think the second. Definitely what you're saying is true. One other thing about disseminating research, this is good. At my new school, they just thrust it into my hand and it cost about £5 anyway, memorable teaching, and gradually people are realising something like this would be quite useful. It sounds like there's a bit of a view that it's not for a want of trying. You know, teachers want to do the right thing. But one thing I've been thinking about, we mentioned growth mindset earlier. I've barely been to a school in the past few years where I didn't see a growth mindset display. The school didn't have a growth mindset champion. As a research idea, it really took. Okay, I think it appealed to teachers on an emotional level. They were ready to receive it. Now, it's critiqued at the moment for some level of overpromise. But something we were thinking of at the Behavioural Insights team was we produce some work, as do others, and then we concentrate really hard on the rigour. Okay, are we sure this is right? We present bar charts. I'm sure a day and a half into BX, everyone's had almost death by bar chart now. And it just starts to get a bit exhausting. So something we did, which I want to play for a few minutes, is we took a trial that we were very proud of, where we were widening participation, underrepresented students in universities. And what really annoyed me about this trial was it worked. Not much works in this field, and we got something that worked. It took 5 years because of the point at which the intervention had to be developed and by the time we collected the data. And whenever I present this result, which I think is one of the best pieces of work that we've ever done, thanks to Michael Sanders and Tim Loynig at DFE who helped work on it, I just got a bunch of nonplussed faces half the time. And I thought, is this just me? What is it? So we tried doing what people out there with less robust evidence bases do, and we made a nice, charming, heartwarming video. So we're going to try that, and we know that many of us are empirical, quantitative types, and just this approach almost makes us feel a bit nauseous. But let's see how we do for 5 minutes, and then we can discuss after if this is the kind of approach that we should be using more. I'm Raj Chande. I'm a principal advisor at the Behavioural Insights team, and I'm also a maths teacher at Mossbourne Community Academy in Hackney. So the Behavioural Insights team was set up in 2010 by the coalition government, and the idea was to take experts in behavioural insights, that includes anthropologists, behavioural economists, psychologists and so on, to come in and take insights from research in those fields and use them to improve public policy outcomes. So in 2013, we were looking at how we can encourage kids from underrepresented backgrounds to go to not just university, but the most competitive ones. And when we were looking at research done by others, we were seeing that even when kids have got really, really good grades, if they're from low-income backgrounds, they're far less likely to apply to university and especially less likely to apply to those really competitive universities. We sat down with the Department for Education and we discussed some ideas from behavioural science that might be able to encourage these kids to make that additional step and apply. So the idea would be that a current undergraduate at one of these universities would write a letter encouraging a school kid from a similar background and says, look, I remember being just like in your position, but take a risk, come here, you'll really enjoy it, you'll get a lot out of it. At the time I was teaching economics at Bristol and I approached Ben and I said, listen, this is what we're trying to do. Does this fit your kind of story of how you came to university? And he was totally up for it.
Raj knew that I'd been in a similar position to the students that he was looking to approach. I'd come from a state school And therefore, I think he wanted a voice that would be able to talk to students in a very empathetic way. I think it's really important for students to have encouragement and guidance when they get their GCSE results, because there are so many options available and very few students know which are the right ones for them.
So once Ben had agreed to write the letter, we went off and we did what civil servants do, and we drafted some documents. So we went back and forth with DFE and we were like, this is the core information and how we think it should be organised.
So the original letter, when I first read it, I thought it was a little bit formal and a little bit too stuffy. And I asked Raj if I'd be able to edit the letter and to put my own voice over the top of it. So firstly, it was really important to say to people, I know what it's like to be in your shoes. Secondly, it's really important to highlight that universities should be seen as an investment, and that good universities cost no more than other universities. And actually, there is an opportunity to go on and be paid more in the future.
And then this is obvious really, the whole point of the messenger effect is it has to be authentic, it has to come from that person, it can't be drafted by me and a bunch of civil servants. And then what we did is we identified about 10, 12,000 kids with really, really good GCSE results who could apply for those amazing universities. And then we randomly chose some of them to receive the letter and some of them didn't, so we could make a comparison. A couple of years later, we got the results back. Not only did we see a substantial increase in the proportion of those kids we were targeting that applied, a lot of them actually went on to attend. So in the end, we increased the proportion of those kids attending those top universities by about a third, which is huge.
I think that going to Bristol set me on a different trajectory to the one I'd been on previously. I was surrounded by people who challenged me, who motivated me, and who gave me opportunities and guidance that I just wouldn't have had otherwise.
I mean, it's a big impact that we saw here, and we were so pleased because it's just a simple intervention, like this role model approach. We could use it in lots of other places too. It's something that different schools and the Behavioural Insights team could be using in lots of other contexts as well. Okay, so I really just wanted to close by discussing, we've talked a lot about building capacity and these sorts of things, but I'm an economist, I'm not uncomfortable making emotional arguments sometimes, but nearly everybody in this room has eschewed a career in finance or something else, much more money, and they did it because they believe in working in education, they believe in doing something for the public good. And somewhere along the line, that gets lost as we talk about external validity and statistical significance and so on. Should we be doing more schmaltzy videos and communication like that? Because that's how everybody else communicates in education. Harry, I'll come to you first.
I wrote a book over the preceding couple of years that was meant to be like, here's some cognitive science, here's how you use it. And one of the things that I decided quite late on was I'm going to wrap each chapter in a narrative. So like, Jenny's a teacher, she finds it really annoying that the kids forget everything. Let's see what Jenny could do. Not quite that patronising, but you get the idea. And I really went backwards and forwards, like how annoying is this? I kind of felt like, okay, what do you remember from Cass Sunstein's thing yesterday? Like the biggest thing that sticks with me is his conversation with his mum. And that will stick with me, it's the narrative that sticks with you, and all the details kind of fall away. So I think, yeah, wrap it in stories because that is memorable. We know that, and as teachers we know that. If I were going to push you before you release this, I'd say that the other thing I added into the book was like, here's the toolkit. Okay, right, here's all the stuff in the chapter. Here's some stuff you could do. So, can you on the end be like, okay, if you're a teacher, tell the kids a story of how you went to university, or tell the kids some other kid's story of how you went to university. Because let's make it easy for people, A, to grasp it, and B, to hang on to it and use it.
Thanks, Harry. Becky, what do you think?
I've spent various bits of my career around comms, and I think it's so important. And I think that without wanting to overgeneralise, many teachers are led, but what takes us into the profession is, as you said, Raj, it's hearts as well as minds. And driving that empathy is perhaps even more important in teaching than in other sectors. So I think that there's much more we can do with this. Things get boring very quickly. You remember I was at the RSA when we were delivering the RSA Animates, those animations where you see the hand drawing. Absolutely brilliant. but I think tired now. So you constantly need to be thinking about new things and new ways to present. It always fascinates me when I watch videos like this, and we do them ourselves at the IOE all the time as well. What is it about the terrible music that makes us take these things more seriously? It's sort of completely counterintuitive. I'm sure our neuroscientific colleagues could probably answer that for me. But I find it amazing that this sort of, the naff music somehow authorises the heart that we're meant to be giving this. But it works, doesn't it? So
I made
whatever
that music.
works.
No, I don't. Ben, thoughts on Muzak, schmaltzy videos, and then maybe we can start wrapping up by telling us what else are we missing in this discussion, and then we'll take that from the rest of the panel as well.
Well, look, as with all dissemination, and to an extent that's what teaching is, it's about horses for courses. So that'll work for some people, it won't work for others, but I think what's crucial is that it's just one part, and it will only work if it is one part of a bigger ecosystem, if you've got the systems and structures in place. So you can have a video like that, but then you have to go, if you're interested to find out more, here's a link through to more detail. And from that, here's a link through to the data we collected and the analytic code we ran in our Jupyter notebooks and the Python that we think. And here's a link through to the systematic reviews on the topic and other work that other people have done. Here's a link through to resources that you can read online to learn about how research works and why we do research and why you should believe this or not believe this. And here's a place where you can book somebody to come to your inset day, as I keep saying. And the thing that I feel like I'm really missing, and I guess Becky as director of IOE, I'd look to you for knowledge on this. Who owns this problem? If we all say, we want to see more use of evidence, we want to see more trials, we want to see better trials on questions that are relevant to teachers and to students and to parents, if we say we want to see that knowledge disseminated and put into practice, who today owns getting that done? What kind of a job are they doing? And what can we do to get better structures in place if they're not doing the job well?
Thanks, Ben. Harry, like a final point that you think just needs to be made before we wrap up?
Let's worry about what teachers care about. Let's study the impact of micro decisions, not whole trials. Like, how much difference, study recently, how much difference does it make if you stand by the door and welcome kids as they come in? Actually makes quite a big difference. Let's think about things we can stop doing as well as things we can start doing. If we're worried about workload, I think we're doing loads of things that aren't necessarily that helpful. And let's work on this. And Singapore took 45, 50 years with one party in government to get where they are now. So we'll look at what are the small steps to build the infrastructure that Ben's talking about that would give us what we want.
I think my takeaway on the professional side is you reiterating Ben's point actually about some of the similarities, whether it's law, medicine or teaching, that we need the knowledge, the corpus, the evidence, and then we need to think about the professional art bit, about how you finesse that in your classroom context. In research terms, I think what's urgent is focusing on the gaps. What are the urgent things that we need evidence on in the classroom? And let's prioritise and focus on those.
Thanks very much. Right on time, good. First of all,
I get to round up?
Oh, sorry.
Do you think I talk too much? I mean, I don't mind.
Sorry, Ben, please.
Look, I'm just really disappointed, honestly. I felt really heartened at first because I thought, everybody agrees now a lot more, or at least in this room. Because in the past, they've been horrible. All online discourse now is vicious. But 8 years ago, people were really vicious whenever you raised the idea of randomised trials in education. It feels like things have moved on. But I honestly feel disappointed because if we all agree, but it's not happening, then the conversation needs to be not, do we agree? The conversation needs to be, chop, chop, how do we get this done?
So can I respond to that very quickly?
Very quickly.
One answer is money, and I think thinking about the resources is the right thought. I'm also interested, who owns it in medicine?
Well, in medicine, we've got a huge sprawling ecosystem. So you've got NIHR, you've got initial training, you've got CPD, where there are commercial vendors and also Royal Colleges that are vendors for it. You've got this huge sprawling ecosystem, and the challenge in education, as it was when I wrote about it 6 or 7 years ago, is how do you create that infrastructure? But when I look around, the people who I see who are doing some good, and I think of Research Ed, the conference in particular, Research Ed is a shoestring hobby. It's a weekend hobby for a teacher. Like, what's gone wrong in DFE or in the professions or in the incumbent well-funded organisations that we're not seeing an explosion, and how can we put it back on the right track?
I'm really going to have to stop it now, but it's good to know. As you can see, this is going to go on for some time outside, and please do feel free to join us. Just very quickly, can I thank all of our panellists, please, with a quick round of applause?